Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the latest European Parliamentary Research Service Policy Roundtable. And it's my great pleasure this afternoon to introduce not only a very distinguished panel of experts and practitioners who are going to comment on this publication, but to mention the fact that every year, usually in January or February, the European Parliamentary Research Service tries to take stock of the budgetary and broader macroeconomic situation in the European Union and in the Eurozone, and publish this Economic and Budgetary Outlook for the EU in this year, 2020. We've been doing this for about the last 5 years, and we've been developing a pattern of analysis which hopefully helps policymakers inside the House and perhaps more widely to think through the implications of the size of the European Union's budget, which of course has recently been very considerably expanded as a result of NGEU, and how that fits into the broader economic picture. And we're particularly privileged to have Vice President SILVA PEREIRA to join us. Thank you very much for sparing time in a very busy day to be with us today. Karlo, who's the Rapporteur on the 2020 EU budget, who's going to be joining us by a video, pre-recorded video link. And a series of commentators who really in different ways are able to assess the implications of the EU's economy and its budget from multiple perspectives. Alfred, who's the Director for Europe in the International Monetary Fund in Washington, D.C., joins us live from D.C., and we're very grateful to you, not only for being with us, but also for being with us at this relatively early hour in the United States. Isabel VANSTEENKISTE, Director General for International and European Relations at the European Central Bank, and only yesterday we had Christine Lagarde here in the European Parliament, and our relations with the ECB are hugely important. Maria DEMERTZIS, Deputy Director of Bruegel, who is one of the most prominent economic analysts here in this city in Brussels, and Alessandro D'Alfonso, head of a specialist team which we have within the EPRS called the Next Generation EU Monitoring Service, which looks at how the NGEU is impacting the individual countries, the individual countries concerned, but also how it fits into the broader picture of EU support for the economic recovery. And that conversation will be moderated by Lasse Bohm, head of the Economic Policies Unit in EPRS. The economic conjuncture, as everybody understands, is really poised at a particularly important moment. Better than expected growth last year is now being clouded somewhat by concerns about inflation, concerns about energy prices specifically, and concerns about supply chain and other supply-side issues within the European economy. And so this is a very, very good moment to take stock of the situation and to try to work out where we go next. And that's the title of this particular event. How strong is Europe's economic recovery? And that's really the issue which we're going to be focusing on today. And the first person who's going to comment on the general scene by way of providing scene-setting remarks is Vice President SILVA PEREIRA, recently re-elected to the Bureau of the European Parliament. He's been a member of the European Parliament from Portugal since 2014 and Vice President of the Parliament since 2019 with responsibility for the budget, for the European Citizens Initiative, neighbourhood policy, and our relations both with the IMF and the World Bank. He's a member both of the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee in the European Parliament and the Constitutional Affairs Committee, which is a very nice combination, really, of the political and the economic, as well as being a substitute member of the Parliament's Committee on International Trade. Before joining the European Parliament, he was a member of the Portuguese Parliament and served indeed as a minister there, Minister for the Premiership from 2005 to 2011. So very hearty welcome. Thank you very much. And over to you to set the scene for today's discussion. Vice President SILVA PEREIRA.
Well, thank you very much. And good afternoon to you all. It is for me a great pleasure to be with you again in an event organized by the EPRS. And it is also good to kickstarting the year with an overview on what to expect for 2022 in the European economy. So I want to begin with thank EPRS for organizing this event. I believe the contribution of EPRS is very important for the work in the Parliament and for the debate in crucial issues and also on economic issues. So my thanks to you, Anthony, and also to Mr. Etienne Bazot from the EPRS. And also, I would like to thank the contribution of our distinguished guests. Now, some introductory remarks only from my part. The first is that we should look back to 2021 and remember the discussion we had at that time. At that time, we had reasons to believe that the situation of the pandemic would be substantially improved. The truth was that some positive signs were then overturned by two variants, first Delta, then Omicron, and they end up bringing back new restrictive measures in a number of European countries, of course, with economic implications as well. And now again, we see more optimistic signs, more openness in our sanitary measures, and so better prospects for our economies. Also because of our vaccination strategy, but also due to the fact that Omicron seems clearly to be less harmful than predecessors. But lesson number one is that we cannot be too sure. So we have to be careful, and we have to acknowledge that the outlook for 2022 very much depends on the evolution of this pandemic. Then it is true, you've mentioned, that we are facing a number of other crucial challenges, inflation, the supply chains issues, the energy prices as a whole, and we have to take them, of course, into account. But of course, that if we look to the report for 2022, what we will see is that we will continue to have economic growth after the good figures of the economic rebound in 2021, even if in 2022 and 2023 that will be at a slower pace. Also, good signs in the employment front with positive figures there, and I believe the measures adopted by a number of states and also supported by the European Union were crucial to get us here. It is important to maintain supportive instruments because an early withdrawal will be an issue for the levels of employment. But having said this, in a more positive tone, we have also to acknowledge the fact that this economic recovery is uneven across sectors and also across member states. So the conditions to respond to these economic challenges are different, and we have to take that into account because our responses in terms of economic policy, they have to address this issue, and inequalities is not a minor issue. In fact, it's one of the most important challenges for the European project as a whole. If we see the movements of discontent of Eurosceptics that raise the flagships in terms of issues regarding inequalities. Then we have the public finances front. Of course, that with the crisis, the deficits and debt have increased. We should expect that, and in fact, it happened. And now the challenges we face have to do with the way we deal with this situation and the way we make the transition for our fiscal rules to be in place again. Of course, the general escape clause cannot last forever. There's a discussion about the timing. In principle, it will cease to apply in 2023. But the way this is done is a matter of substantive discussion, and I will invite our guests to address the issue of this transition. Also, taking into account that we are seeing a movement for a less expansionary monetary policy. So the balance between fiscal policy and monetary policy is crucial at this stage, even if monetary policy remains substantially supportive via the normal asset purchase programs and the reinvestment mechanisms that are adopted by the European Central Bank. The fact that the European Central Bank is being quite prudent in assessing the impact of inflation in the interest rates policy, but nevertheless, the emergency program will end in March, and so we are seeing a movement of the for a less expansionary monetary policy, and if at the same time we see a strong movement for a less supportive fiscal policy, we may face a problem. And my message at this stage is that be careful, because we still can make the same mistake again if we withdraw too soon the supportive financial instruments that we have. And this is even more true because we have also these financial instruments for long-term and medium-term strategic objectives in the European Union, with financial resources allocated to substantive investments. And we have to have in our fiscal policy a room of maneuver to make this really possible in terms of economic growth and investment in our member states without increasing the inequalities, because if only those who have a more sound economy can do those investments, then we will increase inequalities in Europe, and this will remain an important challenge. I would like to recall as well that we have now this new generation EU, and implementation is a crucial word for 2022, but also the implementation of the own resources front of this. And this is something we cannot miss. Now that we have this emission of public debt by the European Commission, it is of utmost importance that we ensure effective implementation of a set of own resources mechanism. Proposals were already done, but from the proposals to the concrete implementation, there's a lot of work to be done, and I hope that we do not miss this very essential element of our strategic objectives. Finally, let me recall that we are already seeing some increase in interest rates in our public debt financial market, and we should look at this in a very careful manner. So the way we establish the overall balance between the monetary policy and our fiscal policy is, I believe, the most important challenge for the future. And really, to conclude, we have also the structural rules for our economic framework. There's a debate going on, as you all know, on the Stability and Growth Pact. What kind of revision should we introduce before ending the general escape clause? A number of suggestions were made. We see important voices, even the President of the European Stability Mechanism very recently, calling for a substantive revision of the rules and not only just drafting elements regarding the definitions of structural deficits or potential growth, these sort of things, but really a revision of the substantive rules that we have there. So this is also an important debate, so that we learn with what happened in the previous financial crisis, that we prepare ourselves for the challenges in the future, and that we take into account that the project of the euro is still a work in progress, and we have to have our rules, effective rules, but we also have to conclude this architecture of our economic and monetary union. This is not done, and this is also a challenge for 2022. So a number of important issues and questions and challenges. So I can only hope that our guests this afternoon can help us to see more clear what should be the future of our political choices. And thank you again for the invitation, and thank you also to our guests. I'm sure it will be a very interesting debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Vice President SILVA PEREIRA, for setting the scene so elegantly. And just to remind you that we're discussing this document, which has just been published by the EPRS, the Economic and Budgetary Outlook for the European Union 2022. It has a special focus this year on NGEU and on investment, but it also has its normal tried and tested and hopefully trusted components, an analysis of the EU economy, the EU budget in perspective, the specific budgetary arrangements for 2022, the budget beyond 2022, the economic recovery, NGEU, and then statistical and other material in annex. It's an annual publication which we produce to try to ensure that policymakers inside and outside the Parliament have the best possible understanding of the trajectory of the European economy and the place within that process of the European Union's annual and multi-annual budget. So thank you once again, Vice President SILVA PEREIRA. And now over to Karlo RESSLER, MEP, who's Rapporteur on the 2022 EU budget for the Parliament, and he is going to share with us some pre-recorded remarks.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, allow me first to apologize for not being able to be with you live during this important discussion. Nevertheless, I hope that with this message I will contribute to the fruitful discussion you will have. As General Rapporteur for the 2022 European Annual Budget, but also as Shadow Rapporteur on behalf of the EPP Group for the 2021 budget, I gained a unique insight to every single stage of this budgetary process, its complexity, structure, and crucial moments needed to achieve a favorable and satisfactory outcome. At the beginning of each legislative process, it's important to put all things into the right perspective and current dynamics. It was clear from the beginning that the negative circumstances caused by the COVID-19 pandemic will have a great impact on that process, alongside the need for a strong transformation of our societies in line with both internal and external developments. Therefore, the main message from the Parliament was clear from the beginning: support recovery from the pandemic, boost digital and green investments, support young people in education and student mobility, and strengthen Europe's capacity to deal with emerging global challenges. All of these priorities complement existing EU goals and lay the foundations for a more resilient and sustainable union. Without going into the well-known details of the main stages of the Parliament's process, such as the adoption of the budgetary guidelines or presenting the compromise package from hundreds and hundreds of budgetary amendments, I think that it's important to underline the fact that the 2022 annual budget is significantly complemented by the Next Generation EU Recovery Investment Plan package. After several months of small but important steps, trialogues, bilateral exchanges within the Parliament, but also outside of the Parliament, and technical meetings, the Parliament and Council came to the final days of the conciliation with really significantly different views, not only on the amounts, but also on the interpretation of the own resources decision, especially on the issue of the repayment of the NGU interests. Following several days of intense negotiations, where they were even suspended at one moment with really no solution in sight at some moments, a compromise was reached on several main issues, such as a joint statement on euro costs and also on top-ups for key Parliament's priorities. The end result was that the Parliament obtained almost 500 million euros for its priorities on top of what the Commission draft budget proposed, update obviously with the first amending letter by the Commission. These increases included key programs such as Erasmus+, Horizon Europe Research Programme, the Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund, but also the Single Market Programme. Obviously, this is only one part of it, and several others important programs for the Parliament were also strengthened. This was an important result for the Parliament because we have delivered on the promises to strengthen those areas where we see the best added value for citizens across Europe. I hope that this brief overview of the procedure, but also of the goals of the European Parliament in the 2022 annual budget gave you a good basis for this meeting. I trust your discussions and conclusions will have a positive contribution not only to the annual budgetary procedure, but on a number of processes where the Parliament exercises its essential role as the budgetary authority. Thank you.
So we're now going to move to a broader panel discussion, and I'm going to invite Lasse Böhm to moderate that process with our four distinguished speakers. So over to Lasse.
Thank you, Anthony, and a warm welcome to all our listeners and viewers today. My name is Lasse Böhm. I'm the head of the Economic Policies Unit in the EPRS, and I'll be hosting this debate. I can only encourage all participants in the audience, put any questions into the Q&A, and I will happily put them, take them up and put them to the panel later on. I suggest we launch our debate immediately by going over to Isabel VANSTEENKISTE. Our first very distinguished guest, Isabel VANSTEENKISTE, is the Director General for International and European Relations at the European Central Bank since November 2021. So we are very grateful, Isabel, that you came to join us today at this very pertinent time. Anthony Teasdale mentioned the visit by Madame Lagarde yesterday to the Econ Committee. Madame Lagarde spoke of the continuous uncertainty, looking at the situation ahead of us. And that also reflected, of course, the remarks by Vice President SILVA PEREIRA, who reminded us of the optimism and the relatively good figures we saw throughout the year 2021, which slightly clouded throughout December and January. So I would suggest maybe, Isabel, that you start with setting the scene from the ECB, and then we go over to Mr. KAMMER afterwards. Isabel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lasse, and thank you everybody for having me here today. It's really a pleasure to talk in this workshop on this interesting topic about how strong is Europe's recovery. Let me just upload the presentation in full screen mode, and I hope you can see this well. So of course, the usual disclaimer applies. As an ECB staff member, my views are my own and not necessarily those of the ECB or the Euro system. In terms of the presentation today, I will split my talk into two parts. Basically, I will say a few words on the conjunctural situation, where we stand currently in terms of the recovery, and then I will take this question: how strong is Europe's recovery from a broader perspective, looking a bit back when the pandemic started and thinking through where we thought at the time we would be today, where we are now, and what has surprised us, and what kind of new challenges that came along the way. And I will focus here on two that I hope from the European Parliament perspective are particularly relevant. So just on the conjunctural developments and looking into where we stand in terms of the activity developments, and just using here real GDP as a metric, I mean, the most common one used, right? If you look on the left-hand side chart, what you can see is, of course, after the very deep dive that the economy took at the start of the pandemic, we've had quite a swift bounce back, and currently we're more or less standing at a pre-pandemic level in terms of real GDP. Of course, you can also say, and that you can see in the chart at the dashed line, the recovery is not complete yet. So we're still some way off if you would extrapolate the trend that we've seen in GDP since 2014. We're having still some gap to go there in terms of, completing the recovery. Now, if you look at the breakdown here between sectors, and Mr. SILVA PEREIRA already referred to that, I mean, we've seen also some unevenness, right? On the one hand, the manufacturing sector actually is already back to this pre-pandemic trend level, whereas if you look at the service sector, it's still below the pre-pandemic level even. So, quite some unevenness across the sectors, and of course, services much more affected by the pandemic, and also, of course, we're recovering because of that somewhat slower. Now, if you zoom in onto the very near-term outlook, what we have seen in the final quarter of last year and the first quarter of this year is some slowdown in activity. And of course, an important factor in that regard was the Omicron variant, which more or less led households to turn away from contact-intensive services. Also, some new restrictions were imposed on that. And you can clearly see in the top chart on the right-hand side that on the services output, the PMI, that's a service survey among purchasing managers, has been decelerating lately. But if you look at the same chart, you can also see for manufacturing, we have seen some deceleration as well. Growth remains strong, but weakened a bit since mid of last year. And there, an important factor has been supply constraints. So supply constraints are there because of a variety of factors, but you can more or less see it as an environment where there has been strong demand that has been outpacing basically the recovery in demand in the manufacturing sector has been outpacing the recovery in supply side. And if you think of some reasons for that, on the one hand, of course, the pandemic has had global repercussions and has affected supply chains. Maybe while we saw easings of lockdown measures in Europe and other regions of the world, you still may have had factory closures. And of course, that ripples through the supply chain. Another difficulty has been for firms, of course, to predict the demand going forward. And you can imagine if when we were at the trough, for instance, of the pandemic, if you look on the left-hand side chart, that's this trough. If you were a company, they may not have predicted actually this kind of rapid bounce back. And of course, as a result, their production may not have been ramped up as fast as one could have expected. And of course, given that we have the Omicron variant, and the third factor, before I forget, I should mention, of course, is we've seen this shift from services to manufacturing, from these constrained sectors, I mean, constrained either by lockdown measures or constrained because households hold back in consuming these services out of fear from the pandemic, towards those goods that were not constrained by that. So durable goods have been particularly strong. So of course, looking forward and in the near term, the Omicron variant may also have some impact here, in particular in the emerging markets where there's less vaccination. This may cause some dent in terms of factory closures, forced closures, and that of course may ripple down and cause further increases in the supply delivery times. But overall, if you look at the big picture in terms of the euro area activity side, we see that euro area recovery is still in a healthy state. We may see some near-term dents because of the Omicron variant, but overall we see strong and solid growth. And we see basically also that the effects of the pandemic on activity are becoming less as vaccinations are helping, but also as we learn to live with the virus. Now turning to inflation, I think anybody who opened a newspaper last week couldn't look besides it that euro area inflation figures are surprising, continuing to surprise on the upside. And I think if you take gasoline at the pump for your car, then you may also have noticed that at least for some goods, life has gotten a bit more expensive. I mean, in terms of concrete figures, the HICP in January stood at 5.1% in year-on-year terms. Now, if you look at the chart, this is the blue line on the left. You can see that's quite a high number. I mean, we haven't seen that for the past 2 decades. And also the speed at which this increase took place. So if you look at the end of 2020, we had slightly negative numbers, and we really very rapidly went to this rather high number on inflation side. So this is also exceptional. Now, why is this the case? So, I mean, the answer is kind of provided already on the right-hand side chart. Energy price inflation has been really rampant. So in January, it's to that 28.6%. That's quite a staggering number. But of course, if you look at the chart on the left, if you turn your eyes back to the gray line, you can see even if you exclude energy and food, we have seen some pickup in HICP overall. And there are a variety of factors there. I mean, one is some temporary pandemic-related factors are still having an impact. We had in some sectors very low prices, especially in the first year of the pandemic in 2020, and we are seeing a normalization. You can give us a nice example is always the airfares, which were particularly low. I mean, those who have tried to fly, I mean, the tickets were sometimes extremely low. Of course, as this normalizes, we see this reflected in the inflation figures. The other factor, of course, has been the energy prices. We have the direct impacts, like we see in the energy and price inflation component, but it trickles through the entire economy. So we see it also, of course, seeping into core inflation. And then the final factor is the imported element, because of supply bottlenecks. It has had an impact on production, but it also has had an impact on inflation. Some goods have become more expensive as it was more difficult to deliver on them. Now, if you look ahead, basically, I mean, we're still expecting inflation to come down in the course of the year. This is, of course, conditional on some factors, and one important one is where we stand on the energy prices. We look at market-based expectations there. Of course, you know, there's a lot of uncertainty in this environment for the moment, and you can also imagine that geopolitical factors play a crucial role. And we also a question, of course, on the supply bottlenecks, where they will stand. And overall, of course, we have to see how this all feeds through in the economy. I mean, these are the typical examples of supply shocks. So they may have an upward impact on inflation in the near term, but they also weigh on households' purchasing power, may therefore affect consumption and investment, and may actually dampen inflation potentially in the medium term. How this will all fan out will crucially depend on the labor market, so we need to monitor very carefully how labor markets develop. I mean, for that, we rely, of course, on the data, but we also basically ask companies what they see, and they do expect some higher wages going forward, but not necessarily anything that would cause us a source of concern. Now, on the monetary policy, very briefly, basically we had a meeting, the Governing Council met last week, and that meeting they confirmed the decisions taken at the meeting in December. Basically, it is a trade-off between, in December, the trade-off was made between, on the one hand, seeing basically the state of the economy being healthier, also seeing the progress towards our inflation target, but at the same time still seeing the needs, especially given the medium-term outlook for inflation, for ample monetary policy support. So just some excerpts here from the February monetary policy statement for you as a memo item as well. So the ECB has announced, and that was already announced in December, to reduce the pace of asset purchases. So this is the combination of our APP and our pandemic emergency purchase program, gradually step by step over the coming quarters. And the PEP program per se will end at the end of March. Given the current uncertainties, and I mentioned that, some of them, right, we have the geopolitical tension, we have, of course, the pandemic still causing uncertainties and the related factors, such as the bottlenecks. The Governing Council stressed that we need more than ever to maintain flexibility and optionality in the conduct of policy. And also the Council flagged its readiness to adjust all of its instruments as appropriate to ensure inflation stabilizes at 2% target over the medium term. So this is basically on the conjunctural development. I'm sure Lasse is getting nervous that I may run out of time in my 10 minutes with the second part, but I promise I will be a bit faster on this one. Just taking a little bit of a broader perspective, 2 years into the pandemic, where we stand. And just wanted to start with these slides to list a few points. I'm sure we can add more to the bullet points here, but I pick up a few that I thought were relevant to highlight. And one, of course, is you know, where we take a step back 2 years ago and where we stood in the pandemic, there was a lot of talk about L-shaped even recovery. So the economy would take a dive down and would not necessarily recover. And one of the factors that played an important role in this discussion was corporate sector vulnerabilities. And then associated, of course, the fact that workers may lose their job even temporarily, and this may cause labor market scarring. So these were some fears, I would say, that did not materialize yet. On the positive side, and I will briefly show you some evidence and some whether we see some risks ahead there. There are also these unexpected developments which are already mentioned in the conjunctural part. And then I will close by talking about two challenges, but it's a challenge and an opportunity at the same time going forward. And one is the twin transition. Of course, the climate challenge was already there, and we discussed it before the pandemic, but the digital kind of accelerated during the pandemic. And then the second one relates, of course, to the NGEU introduction, which is really, you know, it's a great opportunity from the European perspective. And now, of course, introducing new own resources will be an important challenge and a discussion this year and thereafter. But of course, if we take that opportunity, it may also set footprints for the years to come. So briefly on the corporate vulnerabilities, and if you would look historically at a fall of GDP that we've seen during the pandemic and where we would stand in corporate insolvencies, we would have seen much higher level of corporate insolvencies, and that was a fear at the start of the pandemic. I mean, so far that has not materialized, and if you see in the chart on the left, the yellow dots, I mean, we have even abnormally low level of corporate insolvencies. I mean, why has this been? Well, policy really has played a crucial role here, and it was a package of measures that were introduced that have helped here. Difficult to distinguish which one maybe was the most important, but actually analysis that we have conducted at the ECB would show that these measures actually as a package were important, so they were somehow self-reinforcing. But this is the good news. The bad news at the same time is that, of course, the pandemic implied that corporates take on quite an amount of debt. If you look at the large corporates, we see that a lot of these companies took on debt, but then also sit on quite a comfortable cash buffer. So many of them took this debt on in precautionary reasons. But when we start drilling down to the SME level, we see more unevenness. So there, of course, there could be concerns about these high levels of debt. And here, of course, why are we worried about this? Partly because, for instance, the high level of debt would stifle or can stifle firm investment. And in view of the twin transition challenges that we have, digital, green, this is, of course, an important question ahead. We need to find ways to finance this transition, and of course, high debt may act as a brake on that. What is the way forward here? Of course, on the one hand, I mentioned the policy stimulus has been very important. It needs to be gradually withdrawn as the pandemic crisis severity wanes, but of course, carefully, because we don't know what necessarily is all still underneath the surface. Beyond this, here in the slide, some longer-term reforms I mentioned. I will not go into detail, but an important point, and that's the final block, says CMU. I mean, a lot of these elements are discussed in the CMU, the Capital Markets Union debate. I think it's really important that this is being taken forward as well, and in particular, also when we think of reducing barriers to investment for new innovative firms, this is very important. A second fear was on the labor market. We thought we were going to see a rise in unemployment and then employment rate to stay high thereafter. And actually, if you look at the labor market on aggregate, we see that it has recovered much faster than we initially feared. We see quite some difference. I thought it was interesting to contrast here to the US, where of course you saw in the US a major spike in unemployment rate, but a quick recovery. In the euro area, we didn't see that because the choice was mainly to offer job retention schemes. And of course, that didn't then feed into these workers didn't feed into the unemployment rate. So you see here the different policy choices had clearly a different impact on the unemployment rate. Another piece of good news, and this is where the euro area compares particularly favorable so far to the United States, is that we see on the labor force participation, we haven't seen this great resignation that we've seen in the US. There was some drop in labor force participation in the early stage of the pandemic, as you can see in this chart, but it has recovered. And of course, research needs to still understand what isn't the main factors that drove this difference, but it may be the type of support that was offered that could have made a difference. In the US, the choice was more for direct income support. In your area, this job retention scheme. So the worker may be much more attached to their jobs and less likely to drop out of the labor force, for instance. However, there's also some signs to keep an eye on going forward and for worry. And here just showing the Beveridge curve, the relationship between vacancy rate and unemployment rate in the economy. And I want you just to focus on the last data point, 21 Q3, where you can see for a given level of unemployment rate, we see quite a high level of vacancies. So far, as an economist, we would see this as a sign of mismatch in the labor market. But it's still a bit early to draw firm conclusions because in recessions, we tend to find that this Beveridge curve tends to follow a counterclockwise movement. So we have to see to what extent over time this matching in the labor market again improves as the economy recovers, or whether we indeed will see this labor market mismatches going forward, which would provide challenges. So what is the way forward? As I mentioned, the impact of the pandemic on the labor market is still to somewhat extent too early to say. Because also we see this risk of increasing mismatch. We see positive news, but we see also these mismatches. At the same time, very positive is we know signs of a great resignation as yet in the euro area. And the main challenge ahead is really this twin transition, which doesn't only require a lot of investment, but may also require sectoral reallocation and reskilling. And here I just wanted to highlight from some data analysis that was done in the ECB, some positive signs. When we looked at sectors such as ICT and finance, where staff has worked remotely and firms could take advantage of new digital solutions, we found actually that productivity has increased soon after the first lockdown wave. So that gives you some positive signs in terms of reskilling and sectoral relocation that people can quickly adapt to these new realities. Now, just turning to the challenges very briefly, as mentioned, I just highlight two here. There are plenty of others, and Mr. Silva Pereira mentioned also the SGP and economic governance reform. That's definitely an important one for this year, but I highlight here two, otherwise time runs away from me. And one is this twin transition. Here on this slide, just showing basically already just for the green transition, the estimated investment needs, which are huge. And so the conclusion is really we need to rely here both on private and public investment. And of course, we have the obstacle on the private investment side, which I tackled, but of course also on the public investment side, we need to think of ways how to tackle this going forward. I mean, one discussion is of course on the fiscal rules, but an alternative approach is of course to consider the climate transition as a public good, right? And here just a table from Marco Butti and co-author, which I cannot pronounce the name, unfortunately, very well. So I will leave that to those who are more able to do that. But you know, just giving at some rationales of at what threshold, at what point we would see a good provision as an EU public good, and climate would very much fit that bill. So there's really a question: should we bring this to the supranational level, and can you learn actually from the NGU to think of a template for also the climate transition, which you can also consider as an emergency at extremis, but there are also other grounds at the EU level where you could justify to bring this to the supranational level. And then a next challenge, and related to that, of course, mentioned the NGU has had a major impact already in terms of confidence effects, but of course the implementation is still ongoing, and you know, this is key to also understand to what extent we can use this as a template potentially in the future if future crises occur or in other situations. And here, of course, an important element of the discussion is the own resources, right? So there is a reliance on own resources to finance the NGU. This chart, just no need to look into all the details, but just to focus on the white dashed area, there's still some gap to be covered compared to what the estimated spending is and what the revenues are, and this is basically this area that still needs to be discussed. And of course, discussion on that will be very important, and it will be a key element basically also in terms of the success of the NGU, which of course here at the ECB, of course, we very much would support. With that, I want to thank you for your attention to listen to this presentation, and looking forward to the other presenters and the subsequent discussion.
Thank you, Isabel, for these fascinating charts. We go straight to Washington, where we have Alfred KAMMER connected. Alfred KAMMER is the International Monetary Fund's Director for Europe. He's an insider's outsider or an outsider's insider. It's up to you to maybe tell us which one you are. It's also early hours of the morning, and I was wondering, do you share this sort of bright outlook? I mean, if you look out of the window from your office right now, is it still dark or is it already dawning in Europe? What's your view on Europe's economy? Alfred KAMMER, the floor is yours.
I should start off, Lasse, with saying when I look out of my window, it is blue skies and sunny. And unfortunately, I'm not looking out of my office window, I'm looking out of my home office window. I think that also very nicely tells you where we are right now in the recovery from the pandemic. Now, it is a great pleasure for me to be here and participate in this panel. And I will start off with giving our view of the economic outlook and the new numbers which we just published, and also from our Euro area consultation, we published a report yesterday on some of the key policy area. Next slide, please. First, to the context, and very much in line with what Isabel said, due to the corona pandemic, we experienced a sudden stop in economic activity in 2020. GDP plumped by 6.5%. The policy response was effective, both at the national as well as the European level. Policies supported households by maintaining their disposable income. Job retention schemes preserved the link between workers and firms, very different from the US. A cascading of bankruptcy was prevented, and banks maintained credit. We now see that this policy action provided a basis for a strong recovery. The Euro area returned to pre-crisis output levels in the last quarter of 2021, and GDP grew by 5.2% in 2021. Next slide, please. We have, however, downgraded our forecast for 2022 from 4.3% growth to 3.9% growth. This reflects the impact of the Omicron infection wave, but also longer than expected supply chain disruptions and higher energy prices, which may dampen spending. At the same time, against previous expectations, bankruptcies remain below pre-crisis level and labor markets have recovered sharply. Therefore, we now forecast that the euro area will exceed its pre-crisis trend output by 2025, supported by a 1.5 percentage point growth contribution from the next generation EU. But this recovery remains uneven. As Silvia PEREIRA pointed out, it is likely to be slower in countries with a larger share of contact-intensive services, which were hardest hit by the pandemic. This uneven recovery could potentially increase inequality and disparities both across and within countries, to the extent that NGU funds have been allocated to countries based on the impact of the pandemic and based on per capita income. This package helps mitigate an increase in divergences. Next slide, please. Let me move to the policy settings now. The fiscal stance in 2022 remains accommodative and continues to support aggregate demand. As emergency lifelines are being phased out and some are being just automatically used less, we are observing that fiscal support is becoming more targeted. Support should be limited to still affected sectors and be used to bolster safety nets, facilitate labor and resource reallocation, and boost public investment. And once this expansion is firmly entrenched, which we expect to happen in 2022, high debt countries will need to embark on a gradual but steady fiscal adjustment to rebuild buffers from 2023 on. Moreover, should output recovery surprise on the upside, fiscal accommodation should be reduced, especially in countries with high debt, but vice versa as well. If we have a shortfall in aggregate demand, more fiscal accommodation may be needed. Next slide, please. As you know, and as you saw from Isabel's presentation, we saw a substantial spike in inflation in the first half of 2021. This reflected, as we all knew, base effects from low energy prices coming back from the depressed levels of the pandemic, transitory factors such as further energy price increases and supply chain disruptions, one-offs such as the German VAT increase, but it also reflected a strong economic recovery. And as Isabel showed, headline inflation reached 5.1% in January, with energy contributing 3 percentage points. So huge impact of energy inflation on consumer prices. Core inflation, which excludes energy prices among others, stood at 2.5%. And core inflation actually decreased from December to January. I think that's an important point to observe. Inflation pressure should fade as energy markets normalize, supply chain disruptions ease, and demand rebalances away from goods towards services. As Isabel pointed out, we need to monitor and watch the labor market. And while the labor market has tightened, slack remains. For example, hours work remained 2% below pre-pandemic levels in the third quarter of 2021, as you can see in the right-hand chart. And we should not forget that even pre-pandemic labor market conditions were associated with below target inflation, indicating some labor market slack, or at the very least, a limited pass-through to wage inflation. Therefore, we expect inflation to decline to levels consistent with labor market slack as the energy and supply chain factors phase out. What does that mean for monetary policy? It should remain accommodative, but also be agile and ready to respond if upside inflation risks materialize. Next slide, please. There are upside risks to inflation. Oil prices have almost doubled since early 2021. And gas prices have spiked in December. Geopolitical tensions could lead to further increases in energy prices. We estimate that about 10% of today's oil price is the risk premium related to geopolitical tension. So this is something to watch, but there's a lot of uncertainty on how these tensions are going to develop. Turning to supply chain issues, supplier delivery times and the instances of input shortages have increased sharply in 2021. Therefore, additional COVID shocks, including in China, can lead to a further intensification of the supply bottlenecks. So also something to watch. The virus has not left us. The virus has surprised us all the time. So we may actually experience further COVID disruption and supply shocks. Next slide, please. Another upside risk to inflation and output are excess savings. Broadly stable disposable incomes against a large drop in expenditure during the pandemic resulted in excess savings of 8% of GDP. A sharp reduction in excess savings is not the most likely scenario, but some unwinding is certainly possible given that savings rates tend to dip below historical average following crisis. For example, our dis-saving scenario shown in the right chart could increase GDP growth by over 2 percentage points over a 2-year period and increase inflation by over 0.5 percentage points. Next slide, please. The key objective for labor market policy is now to facilitate the reallocation of labor. The two figures in this chart show the structural changes in labor markets during the pandemic and depict how they correspond to longer-term trends. When you look at the right chart, this figure considers the already pre-existing medium-term trends in employment by occupation, which are the blue bars, and highlights how they were amplified by the pandemic, the orange dots. In short, labor reallocation needs from more traditional to more professional and education-intensive sectors were estimated to be large even before the pandemic. So we see an acceleration of these trends, with lower skilled workers likely to lose out. So what does this mean for policies? Labor market policies should support job-to-job transition through training to reskill and upskill workers. Furthermore, increasing labor and product market flexibility remains crucial, and at the same time, enhanced safety nets will be needed to protect and support the vulnerable. Next slide, please. Moving to some of the architectural issues. There is widespread recognition that the EU fiscal framework needs to be reformed. In light of the rise in debt ratios during the pandemic, the application of the current rules would require unrealistically large and counterproductive adjustment by some high debt countries. Another reform area, completing the banking union and the capital markets union should be a high priority as well. A borderless banking system would support financial stability, growth, and monetary transmission. And the capital markets union would enhance and diversify financing and investment options for both households and firms. Next slide, please. And here I move to climate change and the green transition. First, we estimate that the measures envisioned in the NGU package can reduce emissions by 2% relative to 2019. But more is needed. Our estimates point to public investment needs for the climate transition of about 0.5% to 1% of EU GDP each year until 2030. The national plans only cover about 0.2% of GDP annual for 5 years. So there is a gap which needs to be filled. In this respect, the creation of an EU climate investment fund could help countries meet their common climate goals. A central investment fund is meaningful because green investment has substantial cross-border spillovers, and the fund could prioritize investment that can achieve the largest carbon reduction at the lowest cost. And private sector investment needs will be significant. Public policy needs to play a role in setting the right incentives for the private sector. Here, carbon pricing provides across-the-board incentives to reduce energy use and shift to cleaner fuels. Together with ESG indicators and disclosures, it offers a price signal for redirecting new investment to clean technologies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alfred, to Washington. And we will now kick off the debate with Maria DEMERTZIS from Bruegel. Maria, you are an insider's insider. Do you share these assessments on the outlook?
Yeah, thank you very much, Lasse, and a very big thank you to my colleagues for the very comprehensive presentations, and to the European Parliament, who I always value and always love to participate in your events. The short answer to your question, Lasse, is yes. I think the numbers are what they are, and I think both Isabel and Alfred have given a very, in my view, accurate description of what is going on. I think the discussion, and certainly my role in this discussion, is a little bit to talk about the things that are not quite so clear, and how to think about them, and more importantly, what to do about them in this respect. So I would like to concentrate a little bit on the risks in the way that I see them. I won't say much about the opportunities, not because I don't believe there are opportunities. I think there are interesting opportunities when it comes down to productivity. As a result of us having to rethink the way that we operate, look at the way that we organize events, there is interesting things that are going on the productivity level of firms that perhaps could be a subject of another event that the European Parliament could organize. But I think it's important to remember that there are some opportunities that perhaps we could discuss. But for the moment, there are a number of risks, no least the issue of the shape of the recovery that I think everybody has alluded to, including the Vice President. I think this is a first order type of problem. Who are the winners and who are the losers of this pandemic in economic terms? And this is an incredible point that I would like to re-emphasize, and we need to pay attention to that, because we could direct policy in this respect. But the bulk of my comments, I think, I would like them to be on inflation, because we had forgotten how to think about inflation in the past years. As Isabel said, we haven't seen this level of inflation in 20 years. And we had actually, even in the way that we teach monetary policy, we have forgotten that there hasn't been any real inflation risk for a long time. The re-emergence of inflation, however, is slightly different to the type of monetary policy where the central bank can do something about it. And of course, what I mean by that is that this is the inflation rates of about 5% that we're observing now is very much driven by supply side factors to which central banks cannot really do much about. And the supply factors here are really energy prices and the constraints coming from the supply chains. They contribute to about 60 to 70% of the inflation that we see today. It would be a mistake for central banks to try and react to that. It would be very distortionary to try and react to that, given that the excess demand that is coming is not a demand side, but really a supply side. That doesn't help the average consumer who still have to buy petrol, have to fill in the car, or indeed pay the bills of electricity at home. And this is why countries, and by that I mean really the fiscal authorities, have actually tried to help households to do something about that. That said, and all of the speakers have drawn the argument of vigilance when it comes to inflation, we are having indications, and I'm talking about the euro area, not the US, that some of these things are creeping into what we call the second round effects. I know that the ECB and everybody is looking at those second round effects. Second round effects means that the supply problem becomes a demand problem, and then the central bank can do something about that. And in fact, the ECB would really have to do something about it if it had convincing evidence that there are second round effects. One of the graphs that I like to always look at, and I'm surprised actually that none of the speakers use that, is the contributors to the inflation. And monitoring that very, very carefully is important in order to inform us of what happens next. The energy price, the core inflation, and then we have food and non-energy industrial goods and services. As everybody agrees, the energy component and services are the ones that are contributing the most. But what I find interesting actually is the non-energy industrial goods component, which is a small one, is actually increasing. And it is steadily increasing. For that, I actually begin to see the second round effects creeping in. Now, both speakers have told us, and I think convincingly, that the wage increases that would constitute part of these second round effects have not materialized yet, or they are even below pre-pandemic levels. But there's also the producer prices. I would have liked to have seen also the numbers more on the producer prices. Both producer prices and wage increases would be the two components to monitor very carefully. Now, what to do about inflation is as complicated as the diagnosis, in my view. As I said, the central bank the ECB cannot really do much about the supply side factors. The demand factors, when and if they materialize, the ECB will feel compelled, in my view, to do something about that. But even that is not straightforward and is not without problems in itself. The moment the central bank decides to increase interest rates, that is going to have effects on the borrowing capacity of countries. We've even seen it today in Financial Times. Even before any of this has happened, the announcement of easing down of the quantitative easing had an increase on the financing costs for the fiscally weaker countries of the EU. This is a problem which is very specific to the euro area. It's not of relevance to any other constituency, the UK or the US, and it's well known as financial fragmentation. Now, of course, you could argue the ECB's mandate is price stability, but the central bank of any country of any area cares about financial fragmentation. So to argue that the ECB wouldn't care about having directly affected the financing cost of countries is also not correct in my view. So I'll call this the ECB stuck between a hard and a difficult place. Because the ability to meet its mandate on the price stability is going to have other effects on the borrowing cost of countries, which is equally important. The last thing we need in any recovery phase is the spreads to go to increase in unsatisfactory levels that will jeopardize both the recovery, but also, dare I say, the stability of the union. And I think that's very important. So with that, I'd like to introduce the discussion of what really needs to happen in order to convincingly sustain the recovery, but also not introduce risks in our recovery, is the fiscal side. And I think all the speakers have alluded to that. The fiscal side is what needs to be done differently. It needs to be done better and more convincingly to sustain this. And it has two components. One is rethinking the fiscal rules. There are good reasons why we need to have rules, but they need to be rules designed for the future, not for the past. And therefore, we really need to discuss how to reform the fiscal framework in its current existence. And beyond that, and with emphasis to the financial fragmentation argument that I made, we need to pool resources together to meet some of the challenges of the future. And that, of course, opens up the discussion to the Next Generation EU Fund or any other pooling of fiscal capacity that we can design, and Alfred talked about a climate facility. We can discuss what shape and form that should take. Perhaps I'll stop now and come back in the discussion on the fiscal issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. I think you've touched upon, or you pointed out something extremely important, which was already brought forward by the previous panelists, the fact that everything is linked, and we now need to look into the long-term future as well when we want to address and tackle the short-term risks. I think that seems to be a commonality between all the presentations that we saw. Can we just, for the moment, though, stay with the short-term risks before moving to the long-term perspective, if you allow, and just come back to inflation, just simply because it is obviously a major headline topic. Could I ask maybe Alfred to elaborate a little bit on the difference between the euro area and the US, just very briefly for some of the audience, and of course, Isabel, feel free to come in. Although I understand you will not be able to say much more on this, and we know the ECB's position on this.
On inflation, I think what Maria is correct. What we are looking at is energy inflation is basically an exogenous shock and a supply shock to the system. It's having indirect effect and it's seeping into the production. What we then are concerned about would be second round effects. How is this going into wage inflation? So I think that's a very important point to make. What we see in Europe so far is that when you look at consumer price inflation, more than half of the consumer price inflation is actually driven by the energy shock. We also looked at what happened to manufacturing, durable goods inflation, and the impact on consumer prices. That adds 0.5 percentage points to core. And core right now is 2.5%. In the US, a very different situation. When you're looking at consumer price inflation in the US, it's driven very much by durable goods. It's driven also in non-shelter services. So it's very broad-based inflation, and with a special special increase in auto price inflation. So very different situation in the US in terms of when you look at the contribution of the various inflation factors to consumer price inflation. Let me say something on the wage issue, the second round effects. On that one, what we are seeing so far is that wages have increased by 1.5%. This is something, of course, as we have said, we need to watch the labor market. Employment has reached pre-crisis levels. Labor force participation, again, as Isabel pointed, is up. But labor force participation also has been increasing before the increase in before the pandemic. And so we see the slack being eroded, but we think it's not quite close yet. So something to watch and to take care of. And as Maria said, when it comes to demand factor, this is where the central bank needs to be vigilant on and step in.
So Lasse, if you allow, I just complement with some points from to Alfred, basically. I mean, I broadly share what you said, but maybe I start by taking to an anecdote from the strategy review when we had our ECB Listen events and we asked the general public what they were concerned about. And at the time, nobody flagged inflation, right? I'm sure if we would do these ECB Listen events again today, we would get a different view. But while, as Maria rightly said, we have forgotten to think about inflation, maybe to some extent in the general public, I would still reassure that central banks think a lot about it, and we have a large literature, a bigger literature about fighting high inflation than the fighting low inflation has been a much more recent set of the literature. So it's not completely forgotten, at least in the central banking world. I mean, just on a few points that you mentioned, I think, you mentioned kind of two types of second round effects. I mean, in the central banking world, normally we think of them as higher inflation feeding into wages, and then that leads again to higher inflation, and we get this kind of spiraling effect. But of course, the other point you mentioned, and that's particularly true from supply side shocks, right, is that higher inflation may dent consumption and investment, and through that actually has a weakening impact on the economy, which may actually dampen inflation in the medium term. And I think we need to keep an eye on both in this case, right? Because on the one hand, I mean, we're really clearly faced with a supply shock. Of course, we also know from the literature, if this becomes repeated, it's more likely to become entrenched in the economy and may lead to wage demands, which lead to higher inflation. At the same time, of course, the one-off supply side shock, and such high inflation may actually more have negative impacts on growth and inflation in the medium term. Now, of course, an important factor in all of this is of course the well anchoring of inflation expectations, right? And this is also something that one continuously needs to have an eye on. And of course, it's not exogenous to the policy, right? So, and of course, as the ECB has a price stability mandate, this is something very much that the Governing Council will look at, where we expect inflation to be in the medium term. Just on the non-energy industrial goods inflation, you indeed see that creeping up. And that's more or less this kind of pass-through effect that we also see from the supply bottlenecks. And we do have evidence that this takes some time to work out. So that we are still seeing these effects passing on in the economy is not something that really catches us by surprise. And then finally, indeed, on the wage growth, just to reiterate, I mean, also what Alfred was saying, but there, what we are seeing when we ask firms in terms of what they expect in terms of wage growth, they expect higher wage growth. But of course, we very often then get misled by the numbers that we hear because we don't adjust them for productivity. We're also expecting productivity to recover in the economy. So, if you see wage growth in the ballpark that firms say of 3%, that's not, that should not be leading to the thinking that inflation will be off the target, because we need to also take into account the productivity growth, basically, and come to unit labor cost in terms of comparison. So just these kind of points as complement, as Lasse indicated on monetary policy, I'm not a decision maker, so for me, I cannot comment, but the Governing Council will reconvene in March and take updated information into account, and also new projections at the time and coming to its decision.
I'm not sure, Maria, whether you would like to comment. I have a question. If we move slightly from the immediate future to the more long-term future, I thought it was extremely interesting that both of you, Alfred and Isabel, in your presentations brought up the twin transitions, digital and climate, in how far do we need to tackle them in order to have a stable growth trajectory? I mean, in how far should they be part of our economic policy in the future at the EU level?
Would you like me to first attempt an answer, Lasse? Is that okay?
You may, absolutely. Yes, yeah. With pleasure. It's a debate.
Yes. Well, the answer is imminent. This is the two transitions that both our speakers talked about are absolutely imminent, and this was very much the logic behind the Next Generation EU Fund, to free up resources for the national authorities to tackle the pandemic without jeopardizing the investments that need to be done on these twin transitions, the transition for climate, the transition of the digital economy. They are absolutely essential, and if you ask me, I think it's something that we need to look at it even more carefully for the period after the Next Generation EU ends, which is at the end of the decade. And this is where I think the discussions need to concentrate when we think about reforming the fiscal framework, or indeed thinking about how we're going to sustain investments beyond the Next Generation EU. This is exactly what we need to be doing. How are we going to finance climate? How are we going to finance the digital transition, and at the same time ensure that our fiscal sustainability is not being jeopardized? Not every country will be able to dedicate the necessary resources, in my view, given the level of debts that we are seeing. 14 countries are above the 60% in the EU, and 7 are above the 100% of GDP levels of debt as a result of where we are after the pandemic. These are big numbers, and therefore debt sustainability ought to be at the core of our policy making, because we don't want to jeopardize that. The only way of doing that is pulling resources together that are going to be dedicated to the green transition, very much like the suggestions that came both from the IMF, from Alfred, but also the European Parliament made a very interesting suggestion the other day about having a climate facility to finance that.
Thank you, Maria. Isabel,
maybe,
or Alfred, yeah.
Maybe to add on, the NGU provides an important contribution on the climate side in particular, but it only closes 0.2% of GDP of the public investment gap needed in order to achieve the EU greenhouse emission targets. And the gap is for public investment 0.5 to 1% of GDP annually. And the NGU is only for 5 years. We need annual investments of 0.5 to 1% of GDP annually until 2030. So there is a gap which needs to be filled. Second point, it's not only the public sector which is needed. Public investment is crucial. There's no question about it. And the public sector policies also need to incentivize at the private sector. And the one crucial tool is carbon pricing, in order to make sure that the incentives go through all of the production lines. Other suggestions are helpers are the disclosure standards we have, ESG, etc., in order to incentivize the private sector to contribute to the climate transition as well. So both public and private sector are necessary. I would say a third point, it's essential for the economic transition. And it's actually fantastic that the NGU focuses on these economic transition, because you can spend your euro coming out of the pandemic only once. And therefore, focusing on these big transformation which are needing to take place in terms of prioritizing the spending in the EU is the right focus and the right priority.
Yes, I mean, Lasse, not much to add from my side, because I can just agree with the two speakers. I think particularly on the climate side, I mean, if you look at the risks that are happening, I mean, climate change is happening either way, right? So either it's going to happen through increased physical risks, or you basically adapt policies to mitigate and to adapt and ensure that the transition is happening. And I think from an economic perspective, and you can look at many of the model simulations and results, the latter choice is the best one to make, right? And so, you know, putting policies in place to support this transition is key, whether it's in the public investment or the general public sector policies are necessary. And as you know, if you look at the amount of money that needs to be invested, ideally, public sector can only play a small role there. But I mean, although the role in amounts is small, it sends a huge signal effect, right? So like the NGU, you know, that money, if that is well allocated and spent, can mobilize a lot of private investment. And I think that's even more important in this debate and than the mere percentages that we see already from the NGU. But yeah, fully agreeing with the other two speakers on this.
Maybe I can add one more point on the central capacity for climate spending. There are good reasons actually to have it at the center. Apart from these crossover projects, which you can do best from the center. As Maria said, we are talking about a public good. So when you reduce emissions anywhere, you reduce emissions for everybody. And from an economic principle, the most efficient way is you spend your euro where it makes the most difference, has the highest impact, and is reducing costs. And again, this is asking for a central function. A second point, I think, for asking for a central function in climate investment financing is you make sure that the funds are spent irrespective of whether countries can spend it, has fiscal space to spend it, has the political willingness to spend. So you make sure that these investments are actually undertaken. And this is the only real way of making sure that these investments are being carried out.
Thank you. Now, when we talk about policy, I think we all seem to agree of the centrality of the role of the Recovery and Resilience Facility, which is, of course, the main spending vehicle being fed by the Next Generation EU Fund, the new pandemic recovery fund installed last year. I would now like to pass the floor to my colleague Alessandro D'Alfonso, who heads the team of policy analysts in the EPRS, analyzing the national plans and the way the different member states spend the Recovery and Resiliency Facility funds, because I think that's a nice scene setter for exactly this discussion, namely how to spend the funds, how to make sure that they are well spent, and how to make sure that they provide this investment impulse. Alessandro, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lasse, and many thanks to the distinguished speakers for their excellent presentations. 2022 is the first year of the full deployment of the Recovery and Resilience Facility. Following intensive preparations, most national recovery and resilience plans, 22 to be precise, are up and running. It is now time to deliver. The agenda is certainly full. In 2022 alone, the approved plans should meet around 1,000 concrete milestones and targets for measures designed to contribute to a strong recovery. Yes, 1,000 milestones and targets, including for the greening of transport, the digitalization of the public administration, and the reinforcement of health infrastructure. On average, this corresponds to 20 objectives per week. Not all the final results will be immediately apparent, since many measures are multi-annual, but it will be crucial not to allow delays to build up, since all these ambitious plans have to be completed by 2026. I see that the clock is ticking, so I will not go into the details of implementation. But if you are interested, you will find the answers to many questions in this year's edition of the Outlook, with a rich chapter entirely devoted to Next Generation EU, as well as in the new series of EPRS briefings that analyze individual national plans. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if I were to find 3 keywords to keep in mind when looking at Next Generation EU, I would choose the following. The first is investment. As we have heard from the distinguished panelists and their fascinating presentations, our economies and societies are facing major challenges that require significant investment, from the green and digital transition to resilience and inclusion. The 2008 crisis triggered an investment gap in the EU and this persisted for many years. A repeat could be detrimental to addressing such challenges. Conversely, during the current crisis, the level of public investment in the EU has increased, not decreased, as a share of gross national income, and Next Generation EU is contributing to financing this increase. So investment is the first keyword. Let's move to the second. The second is impact. It is true that the EU budget is relatively small, 1.1% of the EU's gross national income. But it is an investment budget, and Next Generation EU, by and large, doubles its size in 2022 and in the years to come. In addition, recovery plans are not only about investment, but also about structural reforms that can amplify the positive impact of investment and improve growth prospects in the longer term. And while the focus is often on recovery plans, we should not forget that Next Generation EU is also financing programs such as InvestEU, that is designed to trigger additional private funding to address key societal challenges. As the previous speakers have highlighted, we need also private investment, of course. So impact is the second keyword. And let's move to the third. The third also starts with I, income. As of 2028, or possibly earlier, the EU budget will have to repay the resources borrowed on the markets to finance Next Generation EU. Potentially, this could reduce the future capacity of the EU budget to invest in key priorities. To avoid this risk and make sure that the recovery instrument favors the next generation and is not a burden on their shoulders, the European Parliament has underlined that new own resources have to finance the EU budget. The first proposals are now on the table and can be expected to be high on the agenda this year. In the context of a broader debate on the financing of European public goods, it has also been underlined. How should we finance public goods such as the fight against climate change? Three crucial I's: investment, impact, and income. And the letter I, with its shape, recalling a lever, leads me to a conclusion. Archimedes said, "Give me a place to stand, and with the lever I will move the world." Next Generation EU is about investing in the future. As such, it is an important lever that can help the EU move towards meeting major challenges in the areas of the green transition, the digital transformation, and resilience. Thank you. Back to you, Lasse.
Thank you. And if you allow, Alessandro, I will take this straight to the panelists. Maria, can I ask you, from your perspective, is the RRF enough? Because that seems to be the key question if we look at the first I, which is investment, and then, of course, the second I, impact, which would be about the governance of the RRF. Who calls the shots, member states or the European Commission, which has to give its okay to the national plans? So is the RF enough? Do we need more? And do we need to do more about its governance?
Okay, on the first question, the answer in my view is no. And we need a lot more. And by a lot more, I mean all of the things that we have heard actually today. We need structural reforms that are going to be directed on both growth, but also on climate adaptation and mitigation. We need new fiscal rules that are going to be designed for the role of fiscal policy in the future. That's a very important one in my view. We need private investments. I think everybody has made this point. And with that, I would also like to agree with our presenters when they emphasize the need for the formation of capital markets union. There's now very interesting evidence coming out from a number of institutes, including the ECB, where it's showing us that when we have more developed capital markets, we can actually meet the climate needs a lot more effectively. So putting down public money in order to attract private money can really happen with more integrated and developed capital markets. So I think that's important. And finally, we need the coordination of fiscal and monetary policy to be more targeted in terms of managing the transitions that we are talking about. On the own resources, if you allow me to divert a little bit, I wanted to say two things. It is really quite astounding that the European Commission has managed to borrow quite so much money and will borrow to finance the Next Generation EU fund without actually the European Union having declared how they're going to pay this money back. I think this is actually quite remarkable, and it's only an incredible vote of confidence, this is the way that I interpret it, on the edifice of the European Union. I thought that's an important thing to reflect upon. But we will need to finance this at some point, and the own resources and the way that this will play out is something that the European Parliament, no doubt, would have an incredible role to play. I urge the European Parliament to involve the citizens as much as possible, because I do not believe that the citizens are aware of the fact that own resources is another tax for the citizens, and even if it doesn't appear on national budgets, it will actually be paid by the citizens. It's important that there is ample communication on what own resources actually means, because it will affect every single European on this. On the governance side, Lasse, which is your second question, I don't know who calls the shots. My job is not to identify that. But what I will say is that unless we do this right, namely the governance is correct and delivers, we will not have another opportunity to pull resources together, in my view, to tackle the incredible challenges ahead.
Thank you. We are slowly coming to an end, but I would like to pose one more question to Isabel and to Alfred. And of course, Maria, you're warmly invited to also come in, which is about what you said, Maria, about the coordination of fiscal and monetary policies. So the need for such a coordination. What role do you see for the European semester in particular? Or indeed, do you have any other suggestions by which these policies could be better coordinated at EU level?
Alfred, do you want me to go first and you compliment me? Okay. Maybe I take the European semester question a bit separate from the coordination of monetary and fiscal policy, because of course, central bank still has its independence, right? So we don't have formal coordination processes, but I can direct everybody to background work that was conducted in the context also of the strategy review, right, where there was a work stream actually dedicated to monetary and fiscal policy coordination. And I think the literature is also quite clear on that when the policy is close on the monetary policy close, we're close to the effective lower bounds. There's a stronger role for fiscal policy basically in the economy, and a more important role for fiscal stabilization to play a role basically, particularly in downturns. So of course, although people are starting to talk about policy normalization, we shouldn't forget that we're still in an environment where the natural rate of interest remains low. So whatever people may think about higher interest rates, I mean, we need to still, as a reference point, take this natural rate. And of course, this effective lower bound problem will not necessarily go away that easily, right? So I think that there's really this literature there, and I think that is an important lesson to be learned. And I think the crisis was an example of that, right, where monetary and fiscal policy worked hand in hand. I try to show also on the corporate side, I mean, the monetary support together with the fiscal measures, but also supervisory. When everybody works together, of course, the effect is much stronger than the sum of each of the individual together. So we really have a self-reinforcing effect. Now, on the coordination role of the European semester, I think it's an interesting question per se, also in the context of the Next Generation EU, right? Because you have the RRFs and you have the discussion on that, and then what role can the European semester play, and should the European semester focus basically on a narrow set of indicators, or should it go broad? And I think that's an important question where we indeed need to learn from the Next Generation EU how that works, and whether we can import lessons from that in the European semester. I mean, and then of course the second question is as the tasks become and the challenges become wider, you know, we mentioned in climate, digital, of course the next generation EU should also increasingly take that into account. So I see a role for the European semester, an important one. How to design it, I think we need to learn from next generation EU, and I think Maria also nicely said that on the previous question basically already, that this is really a process that, you know, if it is a success, I mean, it will be a great footprint for future decisions at the European level. Thanks.
This was already a very comprehensive answer. Just to add one thought, fiscal policy has a role to play in macroeconomic stabilization. It cannot be just that monetary policy has all the burden. And for that, we have been suggesting in the past a central fiscal capacity so that countries save in good times and then they can dissave in bad times. And more of this would be helpful as part of the European architecture.
Thank you, Maria. Would you like to come in?
Yeah, only to second the very last point that Alfred made, that it's important that fiscal policy plays its role in its right capacity. It needs to we need to save in good times so that we have buffers to run down on in bad times. And I just simply remind you that the Next Generation EU Fund is a much more longer term tool, where there's the European semester is on the business cycle, at the frequency of the business cycle. So they do have rather different role. To the extent that we can use some of the way that the next generation is being applied to guide short-term fiscal policy, I think that is an important thing. But I think when it comes to managing fiscal policy in the short term, rather managing macro demand, it is important to make sure that fiscal policies are coordinated at the EU. Otherwise, we run the risk of running fiscal policies very much like we've done in the past 15 years or so, where fiscal policies have been incredibly pro-cyclical.
It's a fascinating discussion. I would love to continue it, but I'm being signaled that we have reached 3 p.m. On this afternoon. I hope we can continue this discussion, though, some other time. I'm sure we will. I can report live that there is some blue sky over Schumann, over there to my right. So the clouds are dispersing themselves. So we go into the rest of the year with an optimistic outlook, I think. I would like to thank all of the panel very warmly for joining us today, in particular Alfred KAMMER for joining us on an early morning. And I pass the floor to Etienne Bassot, Director of the Members Research Service in DG EPRS.
Thank you very much, Lasse, and thank you to all panelists for this extremely stimulating discussion. I think we could have gone for hours. It's quite striking that it's already the time. I'd like also to thank the audience, the online audience that has been with us now and listening wherever you are in Brussels, Frankfurt, Washington, and anywhere else in the EU or beyond. This debate and this discussion today is actually a very interesting scene setter for the debate we will going to have in the Parliament next week on the 20 years of the Euro. And I encourage everyone to tune in to listen to that debate next year. And also in the discussion, the political discussion we're going to have in the next months. I think the discussion demonstrated the importance of the Recovery and Resilience Facility as a sort of game changer for the EU. And it's particular in making sure that the money is dispersed under the RF leads and triggers economic growth. We will therefore in the EPRS continue to carefully monitor how member states spend these funds and thus provide members of the European Parliament and beyond the Parliament and the staff of the Parliament, also the general public and everyone interested in the issue, the necessary tools to assess their performance. And I think here about the work that is done by our colleague Alessandro who presented today. The Economic and Budgetary Outlook, as well as the EPRS briefing on the RF and national plans can be found under our website, EP Think Tank. It's a public good, so please make good use of it. I'd like also, before finishing, thanking also the people behind the scenes here that have been extremely helpful in putting this together, notably Anne-Cécile Charlier. I encourage you also to follow us on Twitter and social media. Finally, I would like to announce that later this week, on Thursday, we will have a very interesting book talk with Fiona Hill on her book. There is nothing for you there, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century. It's about the origins of populism today, so also a large field of reflection and discussion. So I encourage you to register. Many thanks for being here with us. Many thanks for the stimulating discussion. Many thanks to all the speakers. I wish you a good rest of the day. See you. Bye-bye.